Comenzamos el segundo día de la jornada. Tenemos el panel de biometría. En él asistimos a nuevas formas de identificación automatizada de personas. Hoy en día la tecnología de reconocimiento facial no solo se utiliza como instrumento de combate a la criminalidad, el fraude en los pasaportes y soportes de orden público, sino también para acelerar el proceso de identificación de amigos y conocidos en las fotografías que se publican en redes sociales, además de otros hechos. Y con ustedes ahora van a estar en el panel el señor moderador, que es el señor Bochet Biebierovich, que es la autoridad de protección de datos de Polonia, el señor Gus Hussein, que es miembro de Privacy International, la comisionada Sigrid Arts, comisionada del IFAI, la señora Lily Coney, directora asociada de PIC, y el señor Rubén Amato, director de la Dirección Nacional de Identificación Civil del Uruguay. Con ustedes, el panel.
Gracias. Señoras y señores, yo tengo que hablar inglés porque mi español no es suficiente para hablar en la conferencia. So I'm very sorry that I will follow in English. I'm really very happy that there are so many people who arrived in the second day of the conference early in the morning. These are the real heroes always at the conferences, those who really survived and then were able to wake up in the very early morning and want to take part in something more than the meeting in with the coffee. Biometrics. Biometrics as the subject for the discussion in 2012. Was it a subject of the discussion in 2002? Yes. Was it a subject of the discussion in 1992? Yes. So why do we still discuss about these things? Is it really still the same discussion? Or are we discussing something totally different than we had several years ago? I have a wonderful panelist here with me, the people with a lot of experience in the field of the data protection and in the field of biometrics. And I'd like to make this panel as much interactive as it can be. So we decided that we will have short presentations in the very beginning. These will not be lectures, but just the presentations as the starting point for the discussion. And later on we will try to make the interactive conversation with those who are here in the room. So please be ready to ask, please be ready to comment, and please be ready to answer, because as far as I know, most of our panelists came here with the questions, not with the answers. So then it means that that's a good start for the discussion about something which is our data. That is something that I'm always stressing, ladies and gentlemen, dear data subjects. This is your data. This is not the natural resource that we found in a coal mine. This is not something that is stored somewhere in the world in some databases that are under control of somebody. No, this is our data, which is in different places in the world, which is collected in the different places and also stored there. We already had a short presentation of the people who are here in the panel, so let me just skip this part of the presentation, just trying to summarize that we have both the representatives of the NGOs and the civil society, the representatives of the data protection authorities, which is me at this moment, and Ms. Arts from Mexico. And we have also some people who are practically working with biometric data in the public resources, like Mr. Ruben Amato. There were some initial questions that were asked to us by the organizers. Most of them were around the problem of facial recognition and the problem of the data which is stored also in social networks. But as far as I know, we are going to go a little bit out of these questions, trying to ask ourselves not only about the facial recognition, but also the other important changes that happened last years in this part of the authorization process, which we usually call biometrics, and which is one of the three main techniques to authorize the user inside different kind of the systems. Before we start with it, let me just say great hello to our interpreters, whose work will be extremely difficult today, as we will be talking about the technical things, but I hope we will be able to express ourselves the way that the interpreters will be able to deal with as well. If we think about biometrics, I have to say that working with this subject for several years, I have a big problem to answer what is biometrics, where the biometric starts, where it ends. Is it really true that all these techniques that are here on the slide right now are the biometric techniques per se? Is a handwritten signature a biometric tool? Well, from the scientific point of view, yes. But does it really mean that when we have a document which is handwritten, then it means that we are storing the biometric data? That's probably a little bit too far. So we will try to ask ourselves about these borders as well. The important change which happened the last few years, and which I would like to stress, is the problem of the new very popular technique, which is a finger vein technique, which is dealing with the blood inside the finger and the geometrics of blood circulation inside the finger, which especially in the banking systems is more and more popular, and there are more and more ATM machines which are dealing with the finger vein techniques, and the main message from the banking industry is this is something much more private or much more privacy protective than the fingerprint which was used so far. This is something which can work only with the living person. That is something which is not visible outside the hand. That is something that we have to use our own techniques to deal with. Is it really an answer, or is it only the part of the next questions which will be asked about the use of biometrics? Well, of course, we may have different approaches to the biometrics as the idea itself, but we have to admit that this is a part of the current situation. And this is the part of something which we experience right now. And if we look to the very basic books about biometrics, you always find the number of features of biometric technologies that are in use. And there's always something which is called acceptability. Acceptability not only from the technical point of view, but acceptability also from the social point of view. So what do the people will accept if we try to intervene and if we try to intrude in their privacy? And of course, the word adequacy is something that will be on banners of all of us when we will be talking about the use of biometric features, biometric techniques. But what does it mean, the adequacy? What does it mean to have the adequate system for the biometrics? So these are also all the questions that are going to be asked during this panel, and I hope that we will have an interesting discussion about the scope of these practices, about the groups of the people that are affected by that, about the problem of transfer to this biometric data to the third parties, about the security, about the problem of identity theft, and of course the problem of the retention of the biometric data. And once again, when we were preparing yesterday to this meeting, some of us were giving the examples of the biometric data that were collected for different purposes even years ago, and the samples are still in the databases, in the public databases. That is one of the things which we found in Poland, that since 1968, the blood of each newborn child is collected for the medical purposes at the very first days of his life, and actually the samples of this blood are stored somewhere in Poland for last 50 years, and actually nobody takes the control over that. So I'm opening the panel, and I'm asking, I would like to ask Ms. Lily Coney to start with her presentation. Do you want to have a presentation from here? Okay.
Thank you very much. I really am looking forward to talking to you about this. This is the reason why organizations like EPIC exist. We began in 1994 looking at a cutting-edge issue on the availability of encryption to secure messages sent over the internet. EPIC is a public policy research center based in Washington, D.C. We focus on privacy, civil liberties, and consumer rights in a digital information age. Facial recognition, I'll focus on that as a biometric because of how quickly this biometric went from technology that absolutely could not work in 2006. It was perceived as something that had a very low accuracy rate, and although it did not show a lot of promise, we saw so much resources, money flowing into investing in biometric systems by the federal government, and also interest being spurred because of the resources coming from the federal government, that the private sector responded by starting to work very diligently on solving the problems of facial recognition, which made us see it as a fast, quickly emerging issue for privacy. Facial recognition systems are computer-based security systems that are able to automatically detect and identify human faces. That was the first step, being able to determine this is a face and this isn't. That was a hard problem. But we've gone beyond that now, and that was the point we were really most concerned about, not just being able to detect that this is a face and this isn't, but being able to uniquely identify this person is Jose or Jane or Robert or Jose versus this person is someone else. And in order for that to work, you had to have a database of photographs. Now, from our perspective, that database already existed. There were already sources of information to be able to build on once you solved the hard computing problem. Looking at some of the systems that were available then, engine face or hidden Markov models were some of the application approaches to solving the problem. But we got to identity recognition, and now we have the challenges of trying to deal with that in the policy sense. In 2006, the State Department, Energy, Justice, and Defense Department spent $47 million on facial recognition projects. The U.S. government invested $1.3 billion to $2.9 billion for startups and $700 million to $1.5 billion on annual operating costs. The U.S. government provided funds to local governments to purchase mobile facial recognition technology for law enforcement vehicles. By 2011, Facebook announced that it had cracked the problem. Using 60 billion photographs that users had uploaded onto their private Facebook sites, the company had taken that data and used it for a project to figure out how to recognize, uniquely identify persons based on the fact that the photos were uploaded and people tagged those photos with the names of the individuals. So once we got to that point, that's when EPIC filed an FTC complaint against Facebook, basically saying that it was unfair and deceptive for Facebook to encourage users to upload photographs, to tag those photographs, and then to use that information to create this whole new application without getting consent, without providing an opportunity for consumers to opt in, to allow those photographs to be used for their secondary purpose. We filed the case against Facebook because they were the biggest entity out there with photographs like that. They weren't the only ones. Flickr had 5 billion photographs. Picasa had 7 billion, but of course Facebook had over 60 billion with additional 3 billion being added each month. We looked at the fact that users didn't know about what was happening, and the FTC was the natural recourse for filing a complaint. They could act more quickly than trying to do litigation through court action or trying to get some legislative response through Congress and signed into law. We're looking at these components coming together. We hear the word big data, we hear about cloud computing, all of these services that are providing photograph services for online users or networking users. Those are all cloud-based services. These photos are not on your computer. And so many people have used these services that the ability to pull that data back down and put it in a storable capacity may have outstripped the available commercial technology available to consumers. But the monetizing of that, now we have this, we'll have as a natural evolution, the drive to monetize images. We're not just talking about the digital images that we know about on social networking, but everyone who's ever taken a photograph and taken it to a processing service to convert that photograph into pictures that you could pick up a few days later, every entity that processed those photographs, we now have to think about, we know that they did make copies of the photographs that they provided to you. Did they retain that information? Has that information been digitized? Will that information now be monetized and made available for this application? That's something we're going to have to investigate as a civil society organization, because we're not just talking about 60 billion photographs or maybe 70 or 75 or 80 billion photographs. We're talking about hundreds of billions of photographs over the decades that would have been collected and retained, possibly retained by services that process film. Now that we have this problem on the table, we think in terms of who will be the most vulnerable: stalking victims, people who are maybe notable in society but not so much so that people recognize them when they're walking around in the street. The ability to track an individual and link that individual to a profile that's augmented with information just about their routine activity. There are constitutional rights that have been fought for and won in the United States: the freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of anonymity in public spaces. Cases like Alabama versus NAACP are cases that are around HIBO, which is identity cases where you can be compelled to give your name but not necessarily your identity document. And now with this application, all of that may go out of the window. We can anticipate law enforcement is going to challenge your control over your image in public spaces when that once was a right you had control over. We know there are commercial billboards that can identify whether you're a woman or whether you're a man and then serve up an ad. We are now moving toward a phase when they'll be able to uniquely identify the individual. Commercial entities, when you walk into the store, knowing which customer you are and what you bought in the past, and using that information to approach you and talk to you and influence your purchasing decisions on that particular day. Giving, thinking about existing technology like closed-circuit television surveillance technology that would also add to the images that are collected, ATM machines, any place you see a camera will be an opportunity to collect your image and then monetize that image or share that image in a way that would have nothing to do with the original collection or the purpose for that kind of technology being in place. Yesterday, the FTC released a report called Facing the Facts, outlining a lot of the issues that I've talked about regarding digital images. They talk about privacy by design, they talk about simplification for consumer choice, and they also talk about transparency. From our perspective, the biggest issue is going to be consumer transparency and understanding what's going on. We don't see this as insurmountable because that's what EPIC does. That's what a lot of advocacy organizations do. We identify problems, we make sure the problems are brought to the public attention, we use every tool that's available to push the envelope on getting consumer control and consumer rights addressed, and we don't give up. So getting the conversation in this forum to begin the dialogue, not just here in Uruguay, but that a collective universal dialogue is probably one of the most important things that could happen. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present and participate on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for these introductory remarks. Well, now I'm turning to Gus Hossain, whom you probably know very well. For those who didn't have an opportunity to meet Mr. Hossain, he's Executive Director of Privacy International. He was a visiting scholar at the American Civil Liberties Union project on technology and liberty. He's also co-founder of so-called policy engagement network. Has a degree in mathematics from the University of Waterloo in Canada, and also Master of Science in Information Society and PhD in Technology, Policy and Regulation from the University of London. And what is also important, he is the member of the Scientific Committee of Computer Privacy and Data Protection Conference, which is one of the biggest European conference on data protection. Gus, that's your turn. I'm opening the presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. Over the past couple of years, Privacy International has started to focus on the not just the politics of surveillance, but the economics of surveillance. And there are two projects in this domain. The first project is our Big Brother Incorporated project, where we infiltrate surveillance technology trade shows around the world and see what kind of surveillance kit is being developed, by who, and where it's being sold. So for instance, one of my favorite examples is last December at the trade show in Kuala Lumpur, the government of South Sudan, which is only, at that time was only 6 months old, was being shepherded around the surveillance trade show by the Chinese government. And so a 6-month-old government is already buying advanced interception and communications technologies. The other project, and this, the project I'm going to be speaking about today, is what we call our Surveillance as Development project. And that is increasingly developing countries are deploying surveillance technologies, and it's being funded under the guise of development. Here's one of my favorite quotations from a CEO of a biometrics company in 2009. This company was getting some trouble for the fact that they were selling biometric technology to the Egyptian government. And the response of the CEO, not only was this company selling the kit to the Egyptian government, but it was funded by the Danish aid agency. And the CEO says, yeah, this biometrics can be used for surveillance. We can easily design a program for the ID card which enables surveillance of users' internet activities or conversations on Skype. This is business. We sell to those who are interested. If I was approached by Iran, I would sell to them. This is the mindset of the companies we're dealing with. And it's not just the small companies you've never heard before. The very large Belgian company, Zetis, has noted on its website, on top of the fact that it delivers biometric solutions to a number of African countries, that the interest in biometrics is growing. They do note that in Europe there are concerns about privacy, but the burgeoning market of Africa is of no concern is of great concern to them, or great interest to them. That doesn't seem to be the case on the African continent, where biometrics are regularly used, they say. And they are making a lot of money selling this technology. It's not just the companies that are taking advantage of this. It is the fact that funding is coming from very benevolent sources, believing that biometrics are integral to economic development. So the United Nations Democracy Fund has given a vast amount of funding to the UN Development Program, UNDP, to deploy biometric voter registration programs in a number of African countries. In fact, in our research, we've identified biometrics that are widespread at the national scale in 34 countries in Africa. Mostly fingerprint-based, mostly national identity card or voter ID, although increasingly biometrics are being used at the borders. So the US visit programs are now spreading around Africa. The World Bank is funding registration of poor people in Benin and Kenya, and USAID has funded biometric systems in Malawi and Guinea. So when we look at the funding, you have to ask, is it really worth it? What's the public policy foundation for actually funding these programs? In Mozambique, $15 million has been spent on the biometrics program. In Uganda, 64 million euros has been spent on just the biometrics component. UNDP funded biometric voter registration in Sierra Leone for 60 million. And one of the most interesting examples is the DRC, where $460 million has been given to the DRC in order to enable the elections back in 2006, the first democratic elections, I think, ever in the country. The UNDP oversaw the procurement process of 2 contracts, both of which went to European companies to institute biometric voter registration. 10,000 biometric registration kits were deployed by ZETIs. SAGEM was charged with identifying duplicates in the system. 25,000 local operators carried out the registration process, with the technology costing $40 million, but with the registration process costing $101 million for the elections back in 2006. And it was only later a leaked report came out to identify that actually the technology wasn't working the way that they had hoped, and there were over 700,000 double registrations. So whether you see this from the ethical perspective of collecting fingerprints, you see it from the public policy perspective of the costs, if you see it as the funding perspective of there are grave problems in the DRC, is a biometric database the thing that we need to be spending our money on? There's so many angles to question the integrity of these initiatives. But I can't keep on repeating this. When it comes to surveillance technology, whether it's communication surveillance technology or biometrics technologies, the vast majority of the companies are actually in Europe. The most invasive communication surveillance kit is actually developed by British and German firms. Biometrics technologies, they seem to be all across Europe. Companies are making these systems. So here's the irony. You have development funding coming from European and international institutions, supposedly going to countries in need, but that money is being cycled back out of the country to European companies. That is not development as I understand it. So what can we do? We need to work with the funders. They still do believe that the registration of extensive amounts of information on people is good for development. We need to be able to come up with a counter-narrative to that. We need to highlight how foreign aid funding is actually going to European companies for the most part. And as much as I would love to say we must push back against the deployment of biometrics, there are very useful deployments of biometrics, particularly in developing countries where you don't have feeder documents, you don't have databases of birth certificates and whatnot. But we need to identify what are the legal and technological frameworks in order to make a just deployment, a fair deployment of biometrics and registration programs. And I'm going to close with one last example, which is the work of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. For the past 4 years, I've been trying to work with UNHCR. We did an evaluation of their biometrics program, traveled around Eastern Africa and Southeast Asia to see how they were using biometrics. Again, this is a case of a funding fiasco where the Dutch government and the US government gave funding to UNHCR only to develop a biometrics program. And it was of much surprise to everybody that all that money went to a Dutch company that had no experience in developing national scale biometrics programs. UNHCR was terribly excited to deploy this technology because, again, they're dealing with undocumented people. The registration of undocumented people is one of the greatest human rights safeguards that there is on earth. That is, if the UNHCR recognizes you as a refugee and stores your information, you gain protections, legal protections, and you get access to food. It's an incredibly important safeguard. But UNHCR began collecting fingerprints as well, using a technology that didn't work. Except they didn't know it didn't work. It was only when we went to the refugee camps in Eastern Africa and actually tested the technology, we realized the technology was not fit for purpose. False rejections, false acceptance. It seems the only people who actually knew the technology didn't work were the refugees themselves. Nobody wanted to hear that the technology didn't work, and in fact, the administrator after administrator said, we want biometrics in our refugee camps. People are seeking technological solutions to very complex problems, and we're not going to be able to stop that until we address both the funding, the aid component, and the mindset that's behind it. And that was the greatest concern about the UNHCR program. It was the mindset. That is, when refugees used to show up, you'd record their information and hear their story in order to identify whether or not they're a refugee. The fingerprinting program gets thrown into a refugee environment. The refugees become things to be processed. It is how quickly can I grab that finger of that 6-month-old baby and throw it on the red-hot fingerprint scanner, which is terrifying the child. They were collecting fingerprints of babies because they thought that's what you were supposed to do, even though that doesn't work. But they were thinking, okay, we must, person comes, process. Person comes, process. We're just processing people. It's a very worrying development when we see how technology is actually changing our mindsets. And it's unfair to focus just on UNHCR, because I think in a lot of countries where you actually have biometric programs, we are reducing people to things that are observable and recordable. And as I went through Argentina on the way here, I was fingerprinted for the first time in my life, actually. I'm American, so I don't get fingerprinted by the Americans, but I had to get fingerprinted in Argentina. And the staff had no idea how they were doing it. I could tell that they weren't actually even trained on it, but they were collecting the fingerprint nonetheless. I'm not even sure they knew why they were doing so. So the mindset, we become stupid almost the moment we start deploying biometrics as solutions. And soon, the developing countries are going to be seen as the leaders. These policies are going to come back. Here's a piece from just today. It came out this morning from a development research center saying, look at the great work India is doing on getting the biometrics of 1.2 billion people. And they're saying, well, look, if India can do it so easily, look how small the US is. Look how small Germany is. It'll be easy. And so that's my final point. The economics of surveillance technology is very interesting now because, as I said, we're going to these trade shows and we're seeing what's being developed and where it's being sold. Crazy ideas are being developed into technology, and the first market they go for are the developing countries. That's how they develop their economies of scale, and then they bring those technologies back to the democratic world. We have to be careful of this dynamic. So we need to be able to help people in developing countries understand the risks that they are encountering by the deployment of this technology. If you want any more information on our Surveillance as Development program and on our Big Brother Incorporated program, it's on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gus, for this perspective to the programs. Does it work or not? Okay. To the programs which are right now operating. And now I would like to ask our Mexican colleague, Wanda Sigrid Arts-Coluga, who is right now the commissioner in the Data Protection Authority in Mexico, the Instituto Federal de Acceso a la Información y Protección de Datos. Sigrid is former member of former technical secretary of the Mexico National Security Council, and she was also the consultant for the security issues in the World Bank and the public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. She was also involved in several programs in United States, like Pacific Leadership Program in the University of California in San Diego, and she is Bachelor of Arts, degree in International Relations from the Universidad Iberoamericana, and Master of Arts, degree in International Relations and Peace Studies from Notre Dame University.
Buenos días, yo voy a cambiar al español, aprovechando que tengo la oportunidad de hacer eso, así es que agradezco mucho la invitación a las autoridades que tuvieron a bien invitarme para venir a reflexionar con ustedes sobre el tema de los datos personales. En el caso del Instituto Federal, del cual yo soy uno de los 5 comisionados, desde el año 2002 es la entidad que protege los datos personales, particularmente en las dependencias y entidades de la Administración Pública Federal. Y con ese mandato vale la pena señalar que en el caso de los datos personales que recolecta el Estado mexicano, solamente aquello que se recolecta tienen los principios de acceso y corrección, no tienen rectificación o oposición. Sin embargo, allí traemos una asimetría porque somos autoridad para el sector privado a partir de hace aproximadamente 2 años. Entonces, a mí me gustaría en estos minutos que tengo poder compartirles con ustedes algunas de las cuestiones de cómo el IFAI para el sector público se ha venido conduciendo. La ley define los datos personales como cualquier información concerniente a una persona física identificada o identificable, y por ello los biométricos son datos personales y, como en todo, la ley establece los principios que todos conocemos, ¿no? Licitud de información, finalidad, proporcionalidad, calidad, consentimiento y seguridad. Para una autoridad como la nuestra, el desafío no es mayor cuando, y yo les comparto un par de datos, en el mes de marzo de este año, la empresa Unisys llevó a cabo una encuesta del índice de seguridad de la información en 12 países y centró su investigación en el caso de México relacionado a los datos biométricos. Y la encuesta arrojó los siguientes resultados. La mayoría de los mexicanos encuestados señalaron estar dispuestos a proporcionar algún tipo de dato biométrico al gobierno o a empresas privadas para verificar su identidad y como una manera de seguridad y protección de sus datos en los siguientes términos: 64% huellas dactilares, 62% su fotografía o reconocimiento facial, 61% su voz, 60% el escaneo del iris, 57% el escaneo de venas de los dedos. Asimismo, el 60% señaló que proporcionaría un dato biométrico como una forma de incrementar la seguridad en los puestos de control de seguridad en aeropuertos y 57% para realizar transacciones financieras como cobrar un cheque o usar un cajero automático o entrar a un edificio de gobierno, e incluso 23% están en condiciones de dar algún biométrico si eso facilita el acceso a eventos deportivos, teatros o espacios públicos. Solo el 23% se opuso a estas medidas biométricas por considerarla una invasión a la privacidad. En el caso del sector público, la recolección de los datos personales siempre lleva de por medio el que se le informe a sus titulares el motivo por el que se recaba y los propósitos para los cuales se trata esta recolección. Y en el caso del tipo de recolección que ha venido haciendo en el caso del Estado mexicano, me gustaría que vieran, en el caso, a partir del año 2000, lo que hizo el IFAI fue establecer un seguimiento a las bases de datos del sector público. Y en este sentido publicó una serie de lineamientos que establecían todas las obligaciones para el registro de bases de datos y le llamamos el sistema persona, y les voy a dar un ejemplo. Este es el ejemplo que les quería enseñar. Es un sistema donde el IFAI tiene acceso, se señala la dependencia, qué es lo que se recolecta, qué finalidad, cuándo fue el registro, cuándo fue la última vez que se modificó, ¿no? El universo de quienes están siendo recolectados sus biométricos, en este caso en el ejemplo que tenemos en pantalla, son los procesados y sentenciados en instituciones de seguridad pública estatales y federales, y los datos personales que son recolectados, la estatura, el peso, el nombre, el domicilio, el estado civil, el lugar de nacimiento y la huella digital. Pero hoy en día en el registro nosotros tenemos alrededor de 3.154 bases de datos, de las cuales se reporta que 17 de ellas recolectan el ADN en Cancillería, por ejemplo, 69 el iris, Gobernación con la cédula de identidad a menores de edad está recolectando los 2 iris, las 10 huellas digitales, ¿no? cerca de 206 sistemas están reportados para la huella digital y en ellos está el Instituto de Migración y el órgano de inteligencia. Ahora, en el contexto de inseguridad que tan desafortunadamente vive el país, una de las cosas que ha constituido desde la administración pasada es el construir una plataforma que se interconecte con información sobre los biométricos de una gama de actores y ha echado mano de la Federación de los Estados y Municipios para sistematizar, analizar, actualizar información que se intercambia en instrumentos tecnológicos y donde les doy un par de ejemplos del universo de lo que ya está siendo recolectado y al final darles algunas de las reflexiones. Por ejemplo, está dentro de esta plataforma que está interconectada con los tres con los tres niveles de gobierno, el Registro Nacional de Personal de Seguridad Pública, que hoy tiene un universo de 1.457.579 registros. Y en estos registros tienen ADN, huellas digitales, fotografía y voz. La justificación para hacer el levantamiento de todo el personal de seguridad pública, esto es peritos, policías, ministerios públicos y personal administrativo en el ámbito de seguridad, es que de manera desafortunada se ha encontrado que varias de estas funcionarios están involucrados en las actividades también de crimen organizado. La pregunta sería si eso justifica al levantamiento total de los datos biométricos ante una falta de otras medidas que podrían hacer una limpieza sobre el proceso de reclutamiento. Otro de los registros que también se recolecta un número importante de biométricos es el Registro Nacional de Identificación de Huellas Digitales internos en centros de readaptación social locales y federales, o el Sistema Automatizado de Huellas, el famoso EIFIS, que ese lo administra la Procuraduría General de la República, teniendo ya cerca de 50.737 registros. La pregunta es, pues claramente todos estos constituyen elementos que podrían incrementar o no la seguridad y las actividades que se hacen en materia de seguridad pública en el país, pero todas y cada una de ellas tienen sin duda un impacto y una implicación en la privacidad. Aquí yo dejo la reflexión si es proporcional que el Estado posea toda esta información y el IFAI ha tenido casos donde personal del sector de seguridad ha solicitado tener acceso e incluso que se le cancele esta información y aun cuando nosotros hemos dado una resolución para que así sea, hemos entrado en importantes disputas con el sector de seguridad, porque la pregunta se convierte por cuánto tiempo sería proporcional conservar esto si el individuo ya no forma parte de esa corporación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. And going to the more practical approach to the biometrics, I would like to welcome Mr. Ruben Amato, who is the director in the Civil Identification National Directorate in Uruguay, which is belonging to the Ministry of Interior of the Republic.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos a los visitantes extranjeros y gracias por acompañarnos. Vamos a cambiar un poco la metodología de trabajo en virtud de lo que nos solicitó nuestro moderador, que prefiere más que la cátedra, la discusión posterior del evento. Gracias. Había unas transparencias bastante amplias, como 40, pero no las vamos a pasar para cumplir con los 10 minutos solicitados. Desde ayer que estamos escuchando a los diferentes ponentes hablar de equilibrio y balance, de que las personas realmente se encuentran preocupadas por sus datos personales, que a la gente le importa la privacidad, que cada avance parece que pone en riesgo nuestra privacidad. El querido amigo Piñar dijo que podríamos decir avances y puntos suspensivos, porque no sabemos hasta dónde podemos llegar. Y por ahí se dijo también que es difícil pedir soluciones cuando no sabemos dónde vamos. La encuesta que nos hizo conocer y que agradezco Sigrid ahora en México, condice un poco con todo lo que yo pensaba o pienso y traté cuando preparaba la ponencia. En esta encuesta hay un reflejo claro de que todos permitimos, pero ¿hasta dónde? ¿Hasta dónde en pro de la seguridad? Y una de las cosas que me extrañó, que cuando se armó la ponencia o se nos presentó la ponencia, siempre se puso desde el punto de vista de la seguridad. Sí, claro, desde el punto de vista de la seguridad, países que hoy ven que el terrorismo, que grandes atentados que tuvieron, le demuestran que es obligatorio o que es conveniente identificar a sus ciudadanos. Pero nadie, o muy pocos, lo plantean en la nueva versión de lo que es identificar al ser humano, que es como gobernabilidad democrática. Y la gobernabilidad democrática implica una responsabilidad del Estado y una obligación del ciudadano, porque el Estado necesita conocer quiénes son sus integrantes, pero no solo por seguridad, por sus políticas sociales, para saber dónde van dirigidas, porque el Estado no quiere tener NN dentro de su territorio y necesita saber cómo está localizada su población, y no ya como una persecución ideológica ni nada por el estilo, sino porque el Estado tiene que saber cómo dirige su presupuesto, tiene que saber en qué etapa etaria tiene niños de 3 a 5 años, de 0 a 5 años, hasta para las vacunas que va a comprar. Y teniendo una registración, y teniendo a sus ciudadanos registrados, y no teniendo personas fantasmas, como les llamamos nosotros en la terminología de los registros, el Estado puede conocer quiénes son sus habitantes. Claro que también el tema de la seguridad es importante. Y los métodos que hoy nos están... Ahí va. Los métodos que Sigrid nos decía coincide con aquellos que la persona considera que está siendo atacada. Es decir, también lo dijo nuestro moderador, que es que tiene que ser aceptado el método biométrico. Aquel método invasivo, la persona no lo admite. Y tenemos muchos métodos invasivos. Yo me pregunto, y dejo como reflexión para la discusión, ¿hasta dónde necesitamos tanta biometría para un documento de identidad o de viaje? ¿Hasta dónde las empresas necesitan tanta biometría para ingresar a su lugar de trabajo? Porque nosotros hemos visto toda la evolución de lo que es la identificación de las personas. Estamos muy lejos, ayer escuchábamos que se hablaba de siglos cósmicos, estamos muy lejos de las grutas de Altamira, donde el individuo dejaba estampada su huella digital o su mano como señal de propiedad. Este dibujo lo hice yo, porque el hombre siempre necesitó identificarse y siempre necesitó decir, este soy yo y esto es mío y esto me pertenece. Pero de aquellos métodos, pasando a los empíricos, quizás damos por entendido que todo el mundo o que quienes están acá les interesa el tema y lo conocen, pero no podemos detallar específicamente todos los métodos porque si no, no llegaríamos con los tiempos. Pero pasando de los métodos empíricos a los científicos, en Francia se le cortaba la lengua al ladrón, y la lengua al calumniador y los dedos al ladrón. Y cuanto más dedos le faltaran, más robos había realizado. Esa es un signo identificatorio. Y es biológico. Porque es un método o algo que adquirió la persona que lo va a identificar entre sus pares. Luego vino la datiloscopía con toda su evolución. La datiloscopía fue el avance brutal en descubrir que tendrían que pasar 5 millones de años para que se repitiera una huella dactilar, y aunque se repitiera, los puntos característicos y sus crestas divergerían en posición y lugar. Ni gemelos ubiterinos tienen la misma huella digital, y esto es maravilloso, es el signo de decir soy yo, esto es único e irrepetible. El iris, el estudio del iris, el estudio de las venas de la mano, el ADN, no solo pueden atentar, es un método invasivo de obtención. El iris, a veces hay que poner el ojo en un receptor para que capte la imagen, cómo hacemos para identificar a los bebés y hacerles abrir el ojo, sino que también se pueden descubrir temas de nuestra identidad o de intimidad que no queremos que salgan a la luz. Pero también el método biométrico de identificación tiene que ser un método para identificar o para verificar, que son cosas distintas, tiene que ser un método de identificación o verificación automático, que responda en el momento. Porque también el ADN es un método muy seguro de identificación, pero no tenemos el resultado en el momento. Y a su vez tiene la gran contra de que del estudio pueden descubrirse determinados tipos de patologías del individuo o hasta si consume drogas. Y si se descubre que consume drogas, ahí empieza todo un problema en la relación laboral. Las consume dentro del horario de trabajo o fuera del horario de trabajo. Porque el ADN, el estudio del dato biométrico del ADN, del template que se obtiene, no puede resolver cuánto tiempo hace que consumió la droga. Sí, de repente en términos temporales largos, 24 horas, 36 horas, pero no segundos, minutos o hace una hora estaba en el trabajo y estaba consumiendo. Nosotros vemos que las bases de datos, yo las visualizo como pulpos que intentan atraparnos con cientos de entradas por un lado y por el otro. Y de esas bases de datos, a pesar del probable caos que pueda existir, se pueden desentrañar determinados síntomas de nuestra personalidad. Y así hasta se nos puede modelar como trabajadores, como pacientes, para la seguridad. Sí, claro que es importantísimo un documento de identidad con dato biométrico. El Uruguay tiene un documento con datos biométricos del año 1978 y nadie puede decir que en ese momento era por tema de seguridad, porque como país chico que somos, agarramos en la cola todo lo que va llegando y el problema de inseguridad se ha incrementado en los últimos 10 años. Pero les estoy hablando del año 78 y el documento uruguayo tiene huella digital, tiene foto y tiene firma. Dos métodos biométricos estables y uno dinámico, que es la firma. Es decir, porque otra de las cosas que para identificar el dato tiene que ser unívoco, irrepetible, irreproducible. Es decir, no puedo tener dos personas que tengan el mismo dato biométrico para identificarlo porque ahí no estoy identificando. Y nosotros estamos continuamente siendo captados. Nosotros vemos que hay países que tienen más de 4 millones de cámaras en las calles y que los porcentajes dicen que una misma persona puede ser tomada casi más de 300 veces por día por alguna de las cámaras de ese país. ¿Qué pasa con esas fotos? ¿Se descartan? Porque según nuestra ley de protección de datos personales, si se organiza en fichero este dato biométrico, si puede ser sistematizado y localizado al individuo, es decir, verificado e identificado, entra dentro de la ley. Ahora, si son imágenes tomadas en tiempo real, que no admiten identificación con una base de datos, eso no está tratado por la ley, no es un fichero. Pero esas fotos que nosotros subimos al Facebook, hay un programita por ahí que dice celebridades y notoriedades, ponga su foto y le damos los rasgos característicos con alguna de las celebridades. ¿Qué pasa con esa foto después que terminó el juego? ¿Ustedes saben? ¿Se hicieron la pregunta? Porque mucha gente se mete, pone su foto y todavía le pide que sea de frente, que sea amplia, que se pueda observar bien. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa con esa foto hoy que la tecnología ha llegado? Que se copian niños, que se puedan producir imágenes, que haya padres que puedan elegir cómo quieren que salgan sus hijos. Entonces, ¿habrá un clon de nosotros por ahí? Mío creo que no, casi seguro. Nadie lo elegiría, pero bueno. Es decir, esto se lo digo en el absurdo como para decir hasta dónde vamos a llegar. Hasta dónde, y cuando el compañero decía, ojo los países subdesarrollados, no compren cualquier cosa. Le digo, quédense tranquilos, Uruguay está muy seguro de lo que va a hacer y de lo que va a comprar. Estamos en esto desde hace muchísimos años trabajando y no compramos espejitos de colores. Nosotros tenemos el EIFIS, que es un sistema automatizado de búsqueda de impresiones digitales, de los mejores, porque mediante se obtiene la captura y se busca ese rastro en una base 1 a 1 o una base 1 contra todos, Pero ese dato que está allí incorporado en el EIFI tiene la posibilidad de ser chequeado al instante. Entonces es un elemento de identificación biométrico muy importante, porque aquellos métodos, como decíamos, que se prolongan en el espacio, esto se lo voy a pasar nada más para que vean que trabajé, porque si no... Pero les quería mostrar esto. Acá, si uno... Tenemos que tener... La compañera también habló del reconocimiento facial porque yo lo vi en México. Es decir, si nosotros tenemos el chequeo y a mí me toman la fotografía y yo sé que me la están tomando para verificar mis rasgos faciales con la imagen que está archivado en la base de datos, yo ahí no le veo inconveniente ninguno. Ahora, si la búsqueda es uno contra toda la base, y acá es donde nosotros decimos que esa búsqueda puede ser con conocimiento, pero sin consentimiento. Y no es un juego de palabras. Yo puedo saber que me están tomando en el aeropuerto de Buenos Aires la foto cuando ingresé, y que la están chequeando contra una base de criminales, de repente, o de personas buscadas. Ahora, como no tengo nada que ocultar, tómenme la foto, estoy dando el consentimiento para que me la tomen. Pero lo que yo no sé es qué pasa con esa foto ahí. Porque si esa foto después se desvía y es usada para otro uso que no sea el que yo autoricé, porque se supone que si estoy entrando en un aeropuerto están haciendo un chequeo de persona buscada y de seguridad, no hay otra cosa para hacer. Ya esa es una base ilícita. Y no porque es la seguridad o la defensa nacional todo se puede, porque como decía ayer la compañera uruguaya en una de las mesas, hay derechos fundamentales. El de la intimidad hay un derecho fundamental, pero también hay otros derechos fundamentales que sobre la vida y la intimidad yo creo que todos elegimos la vida, preferimos vivir. Pero cuando entran en conflicto otros derechos en pro de la seguridad, en pro de la defensa nacional, esas bases para mí, por más que están excluidas de nuestra ley de protección de datos personales, de nuestra ley de protección de datos personales por el artículo 3, están excluidas las bases de seguridad, de seguridad, de defensa y las creadas específicamente por la ley. Si se desvía del objetivo y cuando me toman la fotografía a mí me lo hacen para guardarme en una base de datos, eso es ilegal, porque yo soy una persona que no tengo por qué estar sin mi consentimiento en esa base de datos. Dejo por acá, la discusión va a ser buena, el juez me sacó tarjeta roja, ya ni amarilla, así que muchas gracias por la atención.
Thank you very much for this intervention. Well, as you could see, that was a good start for the discussion, as there was already some reaction to the things which were said by the previous speakers. So, do the previous speakers want to comment right now? Gus?
I'll let the room.
Okay. So, do we have a microphone in the room that can be given to the people in the public? Yes, we do. So, questions, comments, and reactions. We have the first person to react. If I can ask you to present yourself, not all the people in the room know you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Larry Magid, and I'm co-director of Connect Safely. And I'm also an American journalist, and I'm going to be writing an article on biometrics today. And so there's been a lot of talk about fingerprints, and they've been around for I don't know how many decades. I'm particularly interested in knowing how the more modern aspects of biometrics, such as facial recognition, certainly, and possibly retina, et cetera, are changing things. And I also would like to get the panel to distinguish between the sort of active and passive. So when I went through the same border at Argentina, I actively agreed to have my fingerprint taken, and I actively looked at the camera. I knew that I was entering some kind of database, and I guess I had a choice of turning around and flying back to America if I didn't want to do that. But I'm wondering what other collection of my biometrics have been taken that I'm not aware of.
It may be difficult to determine because there are programs and projects that are out there. When you walk into the airport in the U.S., it's almost like walking into a laboratory experiment because there are things going on beyond your capacity to know. We know some of it, but there are other projects and applications of technologies that are out there. Now, retinal eye scan is something that a lot of people have a lot of interest in for identifying persons and being able to read the retina at a distance.
So you don't have to.
Right, you don't have to put your eye up, you know, but they do still need a database of eye scans to match. So what concerns EPIC more are the facial recognition aspects. Now, when they initially started, the bulk of the images were driver's license records, where they only had a person's face from a certain angle. And if you change the angle just a little, it dropped the accuracy of being able to identify that person. But when you go to social networking sites, you get all kinds of angles, all kinds of facial expressions of individuals, and you also have that tagged. So you have multiple angles of faces under different lighting conditions, different circumstances, different facial expressions. You add that together, you raise up the ability, you increase the accuracy level by having, it's almost like collecting multiple biometrics when you get multiple images of a person's face, and it's readily available, so you don't have to worry about trying to collect the data to create the database. It's there. So that's why there's much more concerned about that than the retinal eye scan at this point.
And just beyond the biometric, we've been doing research on a technology called IMSI catchers, which are, so every mobile phone has a unique identifier, and that's transmitted every time you connect to a network. Companies are developing and governments are buying technologies that act as fake base stations. It can be no larger than this bottle of water, that when flipped on into this room, every mobile phone will connect to this device, so I'll know the unique identifying information of every mobile phone in this room. The reason I'm raising this is because this technology, built predominantly by British firms, are being actively marketed for use at border control points, where you're collecting, because all you're getting is a unique identifier. You don't know who owns that unique identifier, but when you're at a border point where you're not allowed to use your phone, they could be collecting your biometrics, collecting your passport information, and linking that to the actual phone, which they can then use to track you when you're outside of the airport environment.
Let me add one more comment as to the places where we leave the traces and the traces that are in use after that. You have to be aware of the fact that there are more and more projects which are prepared under preparation right now, where also the facial recognition is used, or rather they try to use it, combining the data from CCTV and the data from internet resources. So far it is not effective enough, but there are the projects also financed by the European Union, like the INDEC project. INDEC project, they at least try to check if the CCTV recordings can be assessed by the knowledge management techniques that will use the facial recognition, and combine with the data which is taken from internet, from different internet resources, in order to try to verify who is on the CCTV recordings. As I said, so far the results are not optimistic, but this is the standing of 2012. In 2014 it may look slightly different. Yeah, we have one more comment.
En cuanto a la pregunta de la datiloscopía, sí, es verdad. Hace cientos de años que está en boga ese método biométrico. Hoy existen otros tantos. El tema es que, como estamos hablando de protección de datos personales, podríamos decir cuál es razonable, cuál es ecuánime, cuál hacia la finalidad a la que vamos nosotros, que nosotros buscamos, porque también hay métodos en el estudio que están basados en la irradiación del calor de la piel, y tenemos, allí están basados, hay hasta dónde, como yo empecé la conferencia, hasta dónde vamos a llegar. En nuestro país, que es un país de fronteras abiertas, donde en las fronteras la familia hacia Buenos Aires, hacia Brasil, pasan en su auto, el reconocimiento facial no sirve. Por eso cada uno de las técnicas biométricas también deben ajustarse al territorio para el cual van a ser usadas. En nuestro país se pasa en auto, con un control migratorio integrado por el Mercosur, en los cuales de repente es el papá el que hace todos los trámites y chequean los que van en el auto, pero tendría que haber alguna cámara infrarroja en cada uno de los puestos que pudiera obtener la foto de los que van adentro del auto y si no hacerlos bajar a todos. Entonces, vamos, como dijimos al principio, a la finalidad que buscamos y qué es lo que queremos archivar en nuestra base de datos.
Thank you very much. Next questions and comments.
Hi, Kush Wadhwa, Trilateral Research in London. Thank you very much for your engaging presentations. You know, following the biometric industry for the last decade, I have to say that all these large deployments seems to be a foregone conclusion, really. You have so many of them in the developed world as well as in the developing one, as well as in the private sector. My question to you is really related to function creep and scope creep, scope expansion, what do you want to call it. It happens in the developed world, US Visit, Eurodac, they all expanded. It happens in the developing world. It certainly happens in the private sector as well. And so what are the kinds of things that can be done to combat that? US Visit went to 10 fingerprints and so on. And Eurodac was expanded. Policymakers changed policies, legislators changed laws, and so on. So what are the kinds of things that can be done to combat that?
Is there anybody who wants to answer?
Our biggest concern in the United States is that we relied on the commercial sector to push back when the government wanted to do something on a scale like this. Now we have the commercial sector very much interested in some of the same issues of biometric collection and use for commercial purposes. Imagine not ever having to have a key. You can get into your house, into your car, you can use your phone, and it's all based on your face, or biometric of some type. And the facial recognition might be the turnkey for that application. What happens when you walk into a store and they can determine what kind of customer you are and whether you're a new customer, or can link it to a profile? They know you're a new grandparent or a new parent, and they immediately go to sell you based on this knowledge that they have about you. What happens when every law enforcement agency, local, state, federal, or intelligence agency can use this technology to tie your identity to a profile and make a determination about whether you should be allowed on a plane or on the subway, et cetera, et cetera. Technology that can determine your emotional state is now being used in homes to determine and then show you a commercial based on what they think your emotional state is. And I don't think all these commercials will be designed to make you feel better. It may be designed to get you to buy something if that is the reaction you have when you're in a particular emotional state. That's the challenge when you have commercial and federal agency or government agency interests merge around some particular technology like this. That becomes our biggest challenge. It's not insurmountable, but it just means we know how serious we have to approach these issues and how much harder we're going to have to focus to get some changes done.
Four persons right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Laura Ballard. I'm with the U.S. State Department, but not representing U.S. government views. I actually, before I was in my current position, I was in the position of advising the State Department on its own internal management practices in the area of data retention, management of databases, passport, visa data, as well as employee data. And I wanted to follow up on a point that Commissioner Artz made about excessive data retention and in general resource issues, because it was my experience advising the State Department that data was often excessively retained, not because of some Orwellian conspiracy, but simply because it was cheaper to store the data than to cull the data. And so ideally, yes, you would want to drop a person out of that database when they leave the organization, but data storage became so cheap that a public agency that has limited funds is going to opt for the cheapest option. And I think Gus also gets the sense of that from his presentation and talking about UNHCR. I think a lot of these public agencies are deploying these technologies because they have a mandate, but they have to do it cheaply, and they don't employ quite enough resources and oversight to do it intelligently. And I'd just be curious how you address these resource issues and if we're really going about privacy advocacy the right way. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. There's nothing nefarious about why the data was retained. It was convenient, it was easy, there was no downside. You weren't going to lose anything if you lost the data. I think it's true, and that's why I'm saying it's not just social networking services, it's probably the people who developed photographs for the last couple of decades when computers became, some of these issues came, cheaper storage capacity, a greater capacity to save information. They just didn't get rid of it. But now there's an opportunity to monetize it, which is going to create pressure on their systems for data breaches, compromises of systems. So that's the reality. It's a convergence of these factors that present the issues that we're raising.
Here we have next question.
John Grant with Palantir Technologies, and I'll just say that we don't work in biometrics, so this is just me asking. But it seems to me the most frightening thing about biometrics is too much faith in the effectiveness, that people assume that it's flawless, and I think that contributes somewhat to the public opinion survey that you were citing. People say, "Oh, well, I only have one fingerprint, and so and it's exclusive to me, so therefore this is an effective biometric." But we've seen that it's very easy to fake a fingerprint. I'm sure people are designing contact lenses to fake retinal scans, et cetera, et cetera. And then once that's compromised, you can't get a new fingerprint, you can't get a new retina, and the whole system starts to collapse. What I'm interested in is anybody working on sort of impartial evaluation of the effectiveness of these systems and then educating the public and policymakers who, again, I think have too much faith in how well they work on that score?
Did you have... Please.
First, I wanted to comment on what you asked, Laura. The thing on the data, the excessive retain. As a regulatory agency, one of the things that we are now asking, especially the security sector, is that they have to really have sufficient resources, because not only retention and how cheap it has become, but it's also the quality of the retention. And that if they will have resources for the next administration. We are weeks from changing the administration. In these 12 years, there was a considerable amount of investment in the security apparatus and in the acquisition of all these technologies. So then I would add an additional inquiry, which would be, can you sustain the quality of what you're retaining? And when you move to we had a case where there was a police officer that had passed time in jail. He was part of a database that was not controlled by the executive. It was controlled because he was already been sentenced and was controlled by the judicial power. And he had asked for his name to be canceled from that database. And the judicial branch said, that's no way, because that's the only mechanism I have to see if he is a continuous felony or not. And the guy tried to use the law, but then we were confronted with the impression that not everyone shared the same value of privacy and data protection in the other branches of government. And then on the impartial evaluation that you were asking, every time that a new technology is put in place, when we had the Ministry of Interior started doing the ID card we had to ask for an impact assessment. And the Ministry of Interior was obliged to hire an independent consultant and go through the whole process of examining everything that was going to be collected, particularly because of a political discussion where, for the most part, for adults, we have the electoral ID. So a number of biometrics are already being collected there. And so the policy of the government was to start collecting biometrics of children starting on the age of 4 to 17. And when the impact assessment came out, one of the recommendations was that anyone that was collecting the information had to be trained, because they didn't even know, a little bit in the description of the anecdote that was shared in the table, they really didn't know what they were exactly doing. And parents were asking the people collecting the data, what exactly, where was it going to be collected, what were the guarantees of the collection and the security, how many transmissions could they take care. And so the security aspect, the training aspect, and also the accessibility, because there was a very big discussion, because you are collecting both eyes, both eyes in the case of the children, was a big debate. So we really went hand in hand with the impact assessment, and that was the way for the regulatory agency to get hold of the actions that the Ministry of Interior was taking as collecting these databases. The target was for the minors, 25 million kids. They have only reached, fortunately, 20% of it. It's 4 million kids that have been biometrical now.
About how far the technology is gone realistically, application. Part of the work I do at EPIC is looking at emerging technologies, and our resources are very limited. So what we do first is identify a technology like facial recognition or iris scan. What I did was go to Scilab, which is part of Carnegie Mellon research, Carnegie Mellon University's research, and actually develop a good working relationship with researchers that were working in these areas. They're making a lot of advancement. A lot of the work that they do is specialized, and it's for certain agencies with significant resources to put into these applications. And it was very surprising how far they had gotten on retinal eye scan. Facial recognition is a form of facial geometry, so it's not really looking at a face and knowing it's you. It's doing this high-level calculation of points on a face to determine that this person, a high possibility that this face matches this person. So that's what we're looking at. When we saw what Facebook was able to do, then we know that we're heading down that road pretty quickly to a greater and greater percentage of accuracy. So that's what you look for. It's going to be accurate to a particular percentage point, and based on that and maybe other factors, they'll say this is in fact this person. So it may be geolocation along with facial geometry along with some other factors to say that this person is indeed this person. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about the baby blood spots. The United States also collects that information on all infants born within the United States, because it's a particular test that could determine an ailment that can be, if treated, the child will survive. But the retention of that data is something that has recently come to mind, to knowledge, and created a lot of controversy. So we're indeed looking at some of the same issues because of the DNA potential, profiling potential.
The first and third questions have something in common, and that is they're addressing the real world. We can't speak about iris. We need to talk about the actual implementation, the actual system that's being deployed. We can't speak in the abstract. We need to be specific. And all of these systems are designed for very specific environments. Any engineer would be able to say, yes, it may work in an airport, but it won't work down the street, because you need to control the environments. Let's not get ahead of ourselves and think that somehow this technology works just like it does in the movies, because we'll be making the same mistake as policymakers make. And that's why U.S. Visit went from 2 fingerprints to 10 fingerprints, because it didn't work on 2 fingerprints, but it was sufficient to get buy-in with the 2 fingerprints, and then to say we're going to go to 10 because finally it actually may accomplish something. And And going to the question about the retention, it's all linked to that as well. The reason why U.S. Visit retains the fingerprints for such an extended period of time, I believe it's 75 years, but it might be 100, is because they applied Department of Justice policy on criminal fingerprints. So it was the mindset, it wasn't, oh, we're administering our borders. It was, we are collecting fingerprints that we can throw into a database and treat it like it's criminal fingerprints. So we need to not speak in the abstract. We need to speak about how these systems work. And that's why UNHCR's system didn't work, because it was designed to work at bars. It was designed to let people into a bar if they are over a certain age and they've registered in advance. So all you needed was a single fingerprint on a very small database. But when you're dealing with 20 million refugees in a dusty environment where there's sun outside, oh my God, there's sun. How is that going to influence the scanning? It blew it all up. It didn't work. That is technology. And if anybody says otherwise, they're trying to sell you something.
We have just 10 minutes more, and we already have 4 questions more. So I will allow all 4 persons to ask the questions right now, and then we will finish it all together. First, Vanna from Italian Garante.
Yes, thank you very much. I was in line with Gus' request of assessing the legal and technical framework. So for the legal part is...
To keep the microphone slightly closer to your mouth.
For the legal part is quite easy for a DPA. The technical specification of the system always goes far beyond the legal framework, and there is a need for a technical specification and the involvement of the DPA in assessing if the technical architecture of the system is in line with the legal framework. This is one issue that I have experienced in my work. The second thing is that if you don't associate biometrics from the very beginning in a chain which is secure, then you risk to associate normal ID data with biometrics, and you create much more risk for the case of false identity or other things. And my experience is that government doesn't pay much attention on the security chain. Data, the collection of data, in particular in the visa sectors, is given to private companies, which collect fingerprints and other. So my fear is that there is not so much attention in this massive deployment of biometric associated with identification. Thank you.
First questioner has a second question. Sorry? Hello?
Thank you. Lily, you mentioned a number of things that concern you, like how fingerprints or how biometrics are used, and I think one of them you mentioned was the ability for a merchant to know what you want to buy, and another you mentioned was profiling when you get on an airplane. But the reality is that happens anyway. Right now there's profiling, and it's very crude, and in fact it's very bad, because sometimes based on ethnic identity, people are denied access to planes who should very much be able to fly. And sometimes I walk into a store and I get no help whatsoever, and maybe it would be nice if the salesman came up to me. And so I'm trying to look at, there's some positive things, and how do we not throw away the baby with the bath, so to speak?
I absolutely agree.
Sorry, we have 2 questions more,
sorry.
and then we will...
I'm sorry.
Can I ask gentleman in the front?
Yes, my name is Ian Reedhead. I'm from the Association of Chief Police Officers in the UK, and I have national responsibility for FP, DP and FOI. The reality check, Gus, 50% of people being arrested in London are not UK nationals. They are individuals who are exploiting freedom of movement across Europe to go on committing crime and to evade capture by the police. So identity is critical in order to try and discover their historical past and to ensure that the judges can actually deal with them effectively. In the UK, we use fingerprints, and the reason for that is very simple. Our whole history for the last 100 years is around fingerprints. So forensic retrieval at crimes, murders, is focused upon fingerprint retrieval. And 7 countries in Europe are now migrating to using fingerprints as the primary identifier. The conundrum, I think, today is this. Even government don't understand the delicacy between privacy and legislation. And the best example is the UK's government's rules on taking DNA, because the police were under an obligation to take DNA from individuals who had not been convicted. And the European court said that's excessive, and we actually agree with that. It is excessive. But it evidences, I think, how governments themselves also get confused about these obligations that apply. And the last point, the observation about CCTV. Believe me, the police service in the UK will use every technology that's available to them if it helps us identify individuals born in the UK who are happy to go to tube stations and blow themselves up and commit atrocious crime. We will use those technologies if it helps us find the individuals who commit that kind of activity.
Okay, and we have a lady also who wants to ask a question a little bit. And I'm sorry, that's the last question that I can allow because we have just 3 minutes till the end of the panel.
Okay, great. First off, I just want to say thank you to everyone on the panel. It's really interesting. And I guess my question goes more to the vendors of this kind of technology. Gus, I was really interested when you were mentioning how a lot of these, it's originating in European countries and then it's going into, Africa and, countries in the global south. I guess I'm wondering, to what extent are these vendors actually getting engaged in the approval process and actively lobbying for these kinds of things, biometric ID systems, national IDs, that kind of stuff? Thank you.
I'd like to ask the panelists just for 1 minute answer to those questions that were to you. Lily, will you start?
Minute, okay. I do think there are huge positives associated with technology, and believe me, I have lost my keys before. So, but I also think that I agree with Gus that there is some overselling going on out there, and the reality is it will be multiple biometrics that would have to be used in order to get the level of confidence regarding that this person is who they say they are. That the biggest issue is it's not transparent. We're not developing due process procedures within the application of policies around this technology, and I'd rather deal with that on the front end than on the back end after we have problems.
The companies are absolutely criminal with the way they oversell, and if you attend some of the trade shows, it is unbelievable how they it's salespeople. These aren't they don't send their engineers, they don't send their scientists, they send their salespeople. And to be honest, if I was a policymaker, I'd want to buy it. If I had $1 billion in my pocket, I would buy biometric systems. I would buy national interception capabilities because it sounds so cool. About the police, I've never ever mentioned the police should not be able to collect biometrics. I think that is one domain where we accept that biometrics are collected. I just wish policymakers understood that that is a single domain and it is not the national domain. And the DNA decision in the UK was a pernicious political decision because their goals were to create a national DNA database by antagonizing the relationship between the people, the citizens, and the police. And the police were unfairly caught into that. That is the politics of all of this. And going back to the first question, I couldn't agree more, but we do have to ask, and going back to Kush's question as well about creep, privacy by design for non-policing applications. Privacy by design will limit scope creep, but we will get attacked for the fact that a system cannot be used for another purpose when a greater cause arises. Are we willing to have that fight? Privacy by design is almost anti-innovation. And are we willing to have that fight? I am, but we need to be certain that all of us in this room are capable of fighting that.
Yes, with question number one, I'm absolutely agree with you in terms that the chain of security is very, very, very important. When we were assessing the impact on the ID card, to which we came very, very late, we started with this policy in the year 2009. Basically, one of the things that the security change was not addressing is that we learned that all the technical aspects were divided in different pieces. The software was different from the equipment, and obviously as DPAs, and I share your concern totally, we were clueless. I'm a political scientist, so I would have these technical guys talking to me in Chinese. I simply couldn't understand anything. So one of the things that the DPA group did in our case was we brought people that could talk to us and explain us, and then based on that, put forward recommendations on the security change that I think is critical. And just to give you an example of a positive use of a biometric in technology, it's a positive use, but for a very dramatic event that took place in Mexico 2 years ago, because, and I mention it because it really went around the world, which was a massacre at San Fernando where 72 people were killed. The majority of these people were migrants from Central and South America, and you can't imagine the political tensions that raised. And through judicial and international cooperation, what we did is we took the fingerprints of all the bodies, and we start going country by country on crossing them with their databases. And of the 72 people, we were able to identify 23 from Honduras, 14 from El Salvador, 13 from Guatemala, 4 from Brazil, 4 from Ecuador, 1 for India, and only 13 were left with no identification. But the database is restored there, and we have had men, women, and mothers coming into our borders requesting checking the absence of their loved ones. And that could be an interesting example of how also technology can help for the good of some people that lost their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruben, do you want to add something?
Estamos, creo que todos de acuerdo que en materia policial se pueden recolectar los datos. Lo que sí sostengo es que deberán ser cancelados en la primera oportunidad que se cumplieron el cometido. Y por otro lado, por los peligros que aparecían por ahí, decimos que el equilibrio entre privacidad y acceso en el marco de la sociedad de la información y el derecho de protección de datos personales de los individuos resulta responsabilidad de los responsables de las bases que deben vigilar y defender la finalidad para la que fueron creadas. La seguridad física y las buenas prácticas en la administración de la red permitirán establecer controles adecuados y mitigar todos los riesgos. Gracias.
Thank you very much. And let me add at the very end one remark. Gus said in the beginning that we should talk with the sponsors, we should talk with those who are giving the money, because these are the ones who are actually should control what's going on. And coming back to the question that was raised about the police, that's a very good example of the problem that we may find, because being in my previous life the clerk of the Ministry of Interior, I can easily understand the necessity of using some techniques by the police. And moreover, I know that also the UK police is taking part in the projects that I was talking about. The problem about this project is that everybody agrees that these are double purposes projects. So they are for the police, but they are also to be commercialized. And as far as they are for the police, I can understand the necessity of that. But actually, the European Union is giving the money not in order to create the techniques that will be used by the public bodies, but to create the techniques that will be used by the market. And then the question is, are we allowing the same techniques that are used by the police to be used by the other players on the market? Thank you once again for this panel. Thank you for all the audience for the very brave and practical remarks. And thanks once again for the interpreters for their wonderful work. And the next speaker is a coffee break.